Good afternoon, everyone. Got a couple people beaming in. But look, we will kick off. So I would like to welcome you all. My name is Kate Ames. I am the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Engagement and Access at Torrens University. I'm also the President of ACODE, the Australasian Council of Open and Digital Education, and myself and Dr. Mark Nichols, who is the President of the International Council for Open and Distance Education, would like to formally welcome you all to our session called Access Granted, and we're really delighted to have you. We have a great panel. We have Professor Dr. Janet Rangau, who is the President of Western Pacific University in Papua New Guinea, and we have Darren Britton, who is the National Assistive Technology Project Officer from ADSET, the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training. So it's a really esteemed panel. I would like to formally acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands of which we are meeting around Australia and internationally, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I will hand over to Mark just to traditionally acknowledge our New Zealand friends. Over to you, Mark.
Kia ora, Kate. Tēnā koutou, no mai, haere mai. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's good to be with you all. I'm here representing the ICDE, the International Council for Open and Distance Education, with over 90 members around the world. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. So we've had a lot of interest in our session today, and I do notice that lots of people register and will be watching this online. So we'll be addressing you both on synchronously, but also acknowledging those of you who will be watching the recording here. So just to provide some background to this session. So our organisations work closely together, ICDE and ACODE, and have been for some time and we have a lot of universities, we represent a lot of institutions. And one of the things that is the forefront of our conversations is accessibility. And obviously it is a topic of great interest to everybody, and it means different things to different people. On the ACODE agenda specifically is to develop a benchmark for accessibility, and we are going to be working this year to develop that benchmark. And this session kicks off the conversation, and we really welcome the opportunity to do so with such an esteemed panel. And we have some questions to be asking around what is accessibility, what does the benchmark look like, what are some of the issues that we need to deal with. So I will facilitate the session, and I am going to kick the session off by asking our panel members what accessibility means to you. Now, you're welcome to put conversation in the chat. We will have a Q&A session at the very end for the last 15 or so minutes. We've already had some people ask us questions that we will ask our panel members. It is a really big topic, and we are more than happy collectively to continue the conversation afterwards. But first, I will hand over to Mark just to discuss what does accessibility mean for you from your perspective in ICDE.
Thanks, Kate. It means numerous things. I'm going to pick it up on my presentation, actually. I think on the one hand, we do have disabled learners, many of whom have more than one condition. So there's some very complex needs out there. So the ability to meet those needs is certainly at the very heart of it. But I think there's another layer around it as well, and that is what are any of the access barriers to higher education? I think we should be taking our lens much broader than focusing purely on disabled learners. So I'd be inclined to answer that with a more general sense of how can we open up access to education in general for anyone, not just those who are disabled, but certainly with a focus on those with disability.
Thanks, Mark. That's a great segue to you, I think, Janet, because accessibility is at the heart of your work. So would you like to also tell people who aren't familiar with Western Pacific University a little bit about your background as well?
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Well, Western Pacific University is a new university in Papua New Guinea. We opened our doors in 2021, and we'd like to foster that aspect of accessibility through digital learning, because we are remote in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. We also realized that our hindrance could be the access to infrastructure, digital infrastructure that students must have access to. I'd concur with Mark in saying that beyond disability, I think having, for me, the meaning of accessibility would be having education available to students of any age, students without discrimination to where they are, where they come from, race, culture, or anything of that sort, and also that they can be provided the means to be educated. Yeah, that's for now.
Thanks. We'll expand on some of that as we go through the afternoon. Darren, so from your perspective, what does accessibility mean to you and your organisation?
Thank you, Kate. Look, I agree with the others. And it's very much a loaded question as well. Everybody will have their own definition, so I'm glad that you asked the question there. Look, I'll bring it back to its basics, I suppose, for me, and it's equal access for all students and staff, to give them the opportunity to work and learn, when, where, and how they want. So really providing that flexibility that helps accommodate for disability, for location, for technology access, and all of those things. So it's a very broad term, not just web accessibility, but a whole bunch of things.
So the next question is associated with what questions should we be asking about accessibility when we are looking to measure or assess accessibility standards for learning within institutions, noting that accessibility is not just about the online, it's also about physical learning spaces, it's about the infrastructure that Janet mentioned. So what are some of the questions that you think that we should be asking or you would like to see asked, Dan? I'll go to you, Darren, first.
Look, standards can be, much like checklists, they can be prone to, it's a set and forget and one rule fits everybody. And we know that's not the case when we start talking about accessibility and standards. So I think we need flexibility. We need flexibility within those rules. And which standards are we talking about? As you said, are we just looking at online learning? Are we looking at distance learning? Are we looking at blended learning models? Are we looking at face-to-face, etc.? So, there's a whole range of different things that fit within that. Are we building, I suppose, for that diversity of learners that we've got? So we're designing for diversity from the outset. And how much are we looking at that from a proactive approach and systemic changes versus a reactive approach where how can we fix things we've already got? Do we do that, or do we plan and build for the future and move forward as much as we can? And looking at, who are those standards working for? And as I mentioned before, staff are often excluded in some of that, and we plan for the students, not for the staff that we have. And we need more staff with disability within education as well. Other questions, I suppose, probably more questions than answers here because you're asking that question. Who's responsible, I suppose, for monitoring and implementing, or are these just sit and forget and we hope everybody just goes along with it and things change? I'll note like a recent discussion that we had with Thomas Tobin around UDL, and he brought up things about doing UDL at scale, or universal design for learning at scale, and he was speaking around the 5 things that are kind of needed for that, and that's how do we make it possible. So if I put this in the context of accessibility, how do we make accessibility possible at our institutions? How do we make it permitted? How do we allow people to go and do it, etc.? That's funding. That's a whole range of things. I'm not going to unpack all of those. How do we then support that? That's there. How do we reward it? And then how do we move to that final phase that it's just expected? Putting the opposite, which often we do, we put the standards out and say that's just the expectation. But we've got to get there. We need a plan. We need a roadmap. So I suppose that leads to another question is, when considering standards, are we looking at an accessibility maturity model? Because everybody's going to be at different parts on that journey. It's a very long road. That is a journey, and it will continue to be a journey. Nobody's going to get 100% right and thinking that you fixed it and you've made your education accessible to everybody. Is a fool's errand to do that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. And there's a lot that we can do to improve those things. And I suppose the last one, without hogging too much time with this, would be, considering if we're looking at the standards, who's in the room? When we're looking at informing those standards, do we have people with lived experience? Do we have some experts in the room? Do we have that ability to reflect and look at, well, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what can we build on, and what should we just not be doing more of? That's just going to compound the issues that we've already got.
Thank you. There's a lot in that. But speaking to the maturity, I think I'll throw to you, Janet, because obviously you're kind of early in your journey. So from your perspective, what questions should we be asking, or have you actually been asking with regard to accessibility, given the remit of your institution?
Yeah, I think Darren has set a scale there for, looking at maturity from that end. But I think from my perspective, it's at an embryonic stage where we are building this university, and the question that we should be asking is, how accessible are we to the needs of people who need to be educated? The critical mass out there, and what are the needs that we should be working towards to factor in. On top of that, if we look at institutional approaches, are we accessible, and are we competently or is the institution competently ready in terms of resources, like our educators trained well to accommodate the various type of learning, and especially the point that Darren touched on the universal design learning approaches that we must put in for accommodating learners of all ages, and to provide for them. Yeah. One thing also, I think, for me is looking at how can we look at accommodating the cultural differences, and because we are a land of 850 languages plus, how can we look at that space where we can still provide learning for students, but can allow for learners to switch codes, like maybe to national languages, like we have Tokpisin and Motu, and maybe other languages like sign languages that we can incorporate into our universal design learning strategies. Yeah.
That's a great point. And also the point about educators. Are the educators trained well as well? I think that is real food for thought. So over to you, Mark. What questions do we need to be asking?
Thanks, Kate. I think we should be asking the question, how can we turn access into a relative term and acknowledge that it is just that? Because I think we could say we've got accessible education, but it could always be more accessible. We do a lot of work with open universities and ICDE, and one of the metaphors I've used there is, it's all very well to call yourself open, but if you use the metaphor of a door, how open is your university really? Is it slightly ajar? Is it wide open? And I think accessibility is the same kind of journey that we should all be looking to be on. So in ICDE, we've adopted a new strategy, which is based around the terms inclusive, scalable, and sustainable. And all higher education should aim to be those three things increasingly. So I think a key challenge for us when we think of accessibility isn't necessarily seeing it as a destination, but as a journey ever towards more accessibility. I think that's one thing I'd like to suggest we take forward. And the question is, how can we adopt that mindset? How can we make sure it's infused into how we operate and how we design our education systems?
Thanks, Mark. And the next few questions are actually going to expand some of these conversations. And these questions come from our members. So I'm going to work through, we've got 3 questions here, pending time. The first one is associated with the universal design for learning and the topic of the moment, which is artificial intelligence. So one of the questions is, can you describe the intersection of universal design for learning, artificial intelligence, and accessibility? So Darren, I'll go to you first for this, because I imagine that this is something that you have been considering within ADCET for some time. This is a topic of conversation for all of us.
It definitely is. Thank you. Look, at a very loaded question within itself as well. Look, there's. I think we live in a wonderful and a scary time when all of these things are happening, and we don't know the outcome yet. We don't know where this is all going to land. But what I often say, let's not confuse the two AIs, which often happens, academic integrity versus artificial intelligence, and one is seen as the bad cousin of the other, or the enemy of kind of thing. And with a student support hat on and supporting students with disability, AI can be a game changer. just in terms of that, as I was mentioning before, giving somebody the ability to change curriculum, to change content, to change learning, to their needs, what meets them, help them to simplify information, help them to refine, interrogate, analyze information in ways that work for them. And look, there's a few tools out that are just, I've seen people just go, I wouldn't be studying if this wasn't available. I kind of reached the limit of what I could do at university. I've got to, second year and I'm really struggling now. And along comes some tools that suddenly it's like, it's opened up the world to me. Some of those things were still possible previously, but they were possible with a lot of human intervention, and a lot of time delay, which puts them at unequal, I suppose, level with their peers. They're now 3 weeks behind by the time things have been converted or moved into formats that, work for them, etc. It's still not perfect by any means, but it's been a really big game changer, I think, for students. And I'm hearing that feedback from students. This is changing my life by having that crossover there. And so, the universal design for learning, principles of being able to, provide different forms of engagement, different forms of representation. These tools are allowing those things to happen and to really help focus on, I suppose, that personalized learning, which is really where we're getting accessibility at. What makes this so that you can use it in your personal learning, whether that's the space, the equipment, etc. that you've got. So, kind of roundabout way, does that make sense?
It does, and highlights the ability of a student to actually be empowered through artificial intelligence and actually drive then their own learning and have the conversations that they need and use it in the way that they need to use it. So, Janet, from your perspective.
Yes, I think, yes, in those three worlds, the worlds of artificial intelligence and universal learning design and, accessibility, I think sense making of what can really work is something that we can pursue. We can pursue that. Our students and in this time and age are living in a world of AI, and what can be seen very tedious in the past is now can be resolved, and especially if I'm thinking about accessibility for students with learning disability or some form of disability, I think AI has paved the way, but I would still think that sense making through academic integrity and what makes a student, really learn fully using AI is something that must be pursued as well. Thank you.
And Mark.
Yeah, thanks. Everything that Darren and Janet said, I just want to add another thought, and that is that learning should be work. And I think we tend to forget that sometimes when we talk about universal design, which I think is wonderful and should be in place, but also the use of AI. Ultimately, these should be helping our learners learn to think and be challenged and be extended in their thinking. And I think sometimes, particularly with AI, there's a thought that it can be a shortcut to learning. Well, actually, you can't really shortcut that hard work. I think that's where education really provides the benefits that it brings to offer. You only learn to think more if you're challenged. And for me, a personalized learning experience might be one that's actually easy on me. Sometimes, though, I need to be pushed hard and I need to confront some ideas which I wouldn't otherwise think to confront.
Yeah, great perspective. So the next question is it's quite a big one, so I will try and make it clear. Is how can higher education institutions effectively balance the need for scalable online learning with the requirement to provide personalised support, speaking to that personalisation, for students with diverse learning needs, particularly in light of the emerging technologies? So we've spoken about that, but what can higher education or our institutions do? And also noting that we've got some tertiary institutions here as well. So, and I will go, Mark, to you first on this one.
Thanks, Kate. I think design. I think we sometimes overlook the fact that we design the education that we offer. Universities have designed the ways in which education takes place, and those ways in which education takes place can be redesigned. So I'd be inclined to just start with what the objectives actually are. So what's the balance you want as a university, and then design toward that balance. But I think the real challenge is to not necessarily be constrained by your starting point. So given that you want personalized support for students with diverse learning needs, given that you've got AI potentially there, given that you've got multiple stakeholders, given that you want to be inclusive, scalable, sustainable, how are you going to deliberately bring that type of education about? So I'd be inclined to take a step back, maybe take a coward's way out from answering the question directly, but go back into the design room. What are we going to do? How are we going to deliberately put this together in ways that all of those different objectives are met? And thanks to technology, thanks to the wonderful pedagogies that are now wonderfully proven around the world, there's plenty of options for that design thinking to be expressed.
Great. Thanks. Janet, what about yourself in terms of how can we balance the need for scaling and implementation?
I think collaborative work, collaborative partnerships with the higher education institutions to share. And maybe there's some people who are doing it better and some people who may be starting or are struggling. So I think that collaboration to share ideas, to share knowledge, and to scale up. I think let's not get too comfortable with our conventional and our traditional mode of delivery, but explore and work with agencies that can support to scale up what we are currently doing in our campus-based universities, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great perspective. And Darren, from your perspective, you look inside from the outside. What are we doing well? And
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, and look, and I think Mark and Jen both touched on the key kind of points there, and that's that it's the designing for diversity. So we need to have a plan, and it's the I suppose starting a bit of that reflective. Where are we, and what do we actually want to be? And that will be different for every institution. Everybody's got different resources, different staffing capabilities, etc., different expertise. So what do we want our institutions to look like? And then we can look at what's already working. What can we build on that we've got? We don't need to design from scratch. We've already got some things that might be working really well. How do we support those? How do we expand those and foster those? How do we collaborate with others to make sure that that can be shared, within our institution, even cross institutions? We all learn from each other. And that's what these sessions are about as well. So I think that's really important, as much as, what doesn't work that's there. What can we grandfather out kind of thing? What can we say? We're doing this for another year and then we're dropping that. Not these hard changes that seem to happen when we have big, institutional change processes happen. Here we've got a new model and a new plan, and this is what we're doing. And we leave a lot of people, a lot of staff behind. We're not building digital capabilities. We're not, we haven't allowed for, professional development and time for those things to happen. So, how do we do these things? I suppose, as Mark was saying, strategically with some good thought in there, what's actually working? What can we build on to start with, as much as what can we start to do less of, in that sense that's there? And getting back to that, I suppose that central part of the question, how are we then supporting students, in that process? But in order to support the students, we need to support the staff. And if the staff aren't there and the staff aren't capable to help and provide that support, or aren't demonstrating the tools, or how we're making things digitally equitable, etc., then we're hurting ourselves in the process.
So I am going to come back to all of our panel members to ask a question about where you've seen that kind of design that you've spoken about work really well. And if you haven't ever seen it work really well, then, where it might be improved. So while you're thinking about that, I will also ask the question, which is the final question from our members: how can inclusive education have broad implications, especially in the government sector? So that is a broadening. Obviously, education has got, it does so much, does not really. So we have an opportunity to set the agenda here with some of the work that we do. So this is the question: how can inclusive education have broad implications, and particularly in government policy setting, etc. So only because you're actually sitting in front of me in the big screen, Darren, I will go to you first.
The easy questions.
A lot of the work that this is the easy question. Yeah, this is the kind of work that AdSet is really good at in terms of setting agenda and influencing policy, etc.
Yeah, look, and it's a hard one. Change takes time. We know that. I once had heard like a DVC, or Deputy Vice Chancellor Academic, talk about, our institutions are massive big ships, and they take a long time to slow down, and they take a long time to get up to speed, and a long time to change course. So a lot of things have to kind of happen in parallel for things to shift slightly over time, but eventually, the whole boat's moving that way, or the whole ship's moving that way. So expecting immediate change is really hard with that. And it's much the same with government policy. Universities, I'll talk about that, and there's current changes in funding. The government's enabled another $40 million, or quadrupled the amount of money that's in disability support. But again, that's just looking at disability support. But there's also that when we talk about those equity groups, there's a lot more than just certainly disability. And it's often, we can name the groups and then it's and disability added on to the end. There's these groups and disability, and it's like there's intersectionality across all of those groups as well, but they're not represented equally with funding by any means. We know the numbers are certainly going up at our institutions. It's almost doubled in the last 6 years or something like that. It's one of the largest minorities, if you can call it that we now have in tertiary education. So we need to be paying attention to that, and I think the government is, and they're looking at that, but they don't know all the answers in that space yet. And I think, look, there's an opportunity for what hasn't happened in a lot of institutions. I haven't seen it happen in a lot of institutions. We've got funding for teaching and learning on one side, we've got funding for student support on the other. Well, we need funding that sits somewhere in between, that connects those two. It's not the role or responsibility of one area to look after this and the other to do this, or it's not the learning designer's job to do this, and it's not the academic's job. It's everybody's job. And that's where accessibility and designing for diversity and that comes in. It's everybody's job to support that change, and changing those policies means changing people's minds and things as well. So I think the more people can do it well, the more others can see it and see actually being accessible. These kind of things is actually making us more sustainable. It means we can pick up our curriculum, we can pick up our stuff and put it into different platforms. We can shift things across. We can quickly react. And how do we shift those things? We're saying to be proactive. So there's probably a lot there. Sorry about that.
I've got some questions. I do have probably a couple of other add-on questions, but I'm going to go to Janet on terms of how can inclusive education have broad implications?
Yes, I think looking at gauging government support and trying to advocate for the political will to support what we do in universities and higher education institutions. If we have people having the same mindset like what we are trying to do for access and inclusiveness at government level, I mean, the challenge is to get them on board and to get them to look through the lens that we see and we're trying to advocate for in terms of access. In the context of Papua New Guinea, where the challenges such as limited internet connectivity, high cost of digital device, and high cost of maintaining institution as such, I think a government, or maybe I should say the institutions, can take ownership into trying to take the small steps into what can be done at their level and engaging the political will at government level, working with agencies to support our endeavor for maybe digital learning in terms of getting it to be accessible to a lot more, people who need to be educated. Yeah, thank you.
So, Janet, I think it's worth really drilling down actually on Western Pacific University, and because you're based in the Highlands, is that correct? And so
Yes.
The very premise of your institution was on that, the educating populations and making education accessible. So with regard, how do you feel that that is working, and what are some of the challenges associated with that? In terms of making actually education accessible, are you achieving what you set out to achieve at this particular point?
Yeah, we started with the baby step, and that is to look at how we can deliver that on campus. And I'm really glad that from the perspective of ICDE, the scalability notion, now how do we scale up is the question that we are now trying to move towards, and how do we recruit more students to our space, for what we had started for, the digital transformation, especially in the rural space of Papua New Guinea. I mean, for us, educating people to be just digitally fluent is something that is a satisfaction to us. But how can we scale up? How can we expand what we are now doing from the baby step to the, getting more accessibility to our programs online and to reaching the unreached, where they don't need to come onto campus, but we can provide for them. And I think that would be a greater satisfaction on our end, where students can learn from where they are, and we would be satisfied that we are providing that accessibility in Papua New Guinea, of course. And also I would not like to rule out the fact that we are open for collaboration. And under the Department of Higher Education, we now have a policy that allows Papua New Guinean universities to partner with international universities who are already doing the good things, who are already exhibiting the good practices. So rather than we reinventing the wheel, because we are coming from a context where we are resource poor, rather than we trying to build that without enough support or funding, we'd rather partner with organizations, and networks like ACODE and ICDE are very good platforms that we can learn of. And of course, universities out there who are already doing the right thing in terms of accessibility or universal learning design and so forth in building up our capability and our capacity. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Janet. And that really speaks to that maturity model that Darren was talking about earlier, about the different levels and stages of institutions in terms of the development along the way. So back over to you, Mark. How can inclusive education have broad implications?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. First, congratulations, Janet. I think the sort of work you're doing there is amazing, and exactly the sort of thing too that many countries around the world have picked up on in the open education movement. I think we shouldn't underestimate the challenges that governments face in trying to bring about inclusive education. There's a huge challenge in trying to use the limited resources that governments have constructively towards that end. I think it's quite a challenge that sometimes we can forget. But most governments around the world will have some commitment to lifelong learning, the upskilling and retraining of its populations. So inclusive education certainly does have broad implications. It can mean the difference between economic growth and economic stagnation. It can mean enriching the lives of citizens. So in the government sector, I think they do face significant challenges. And one thing we're trying to do this year in the ICDE conference coming up in November in Wellington, New Zealand, is actually bring that about in conversation. So we've got a 4-day conference. The pre-conference day is the Monday, and on that day we're going to have an education policy forum where we're going to have conversations at that level. So how can we influence government or even support government to bring about the sorts of policies that are required to encourage true, inclusive, scalable and sustainable education? Not necessarily reinforcing the current model, which in many ways isn't inclusive, isn't scalable, and certainly isn't sustainable based on the numbers that we see come through. But how can we actually get institutions to take the right line towards those objectives at the policy level? So for those of you attending, I'd look forward to greeting you in 3 dimensions in Wellington, New Zealand in November. But the first day, you're more than welcome to attend that Education Policy Forum. We've got the New Zealand Minister of Vocational Education opening that, which is just an indication of the level of conversation that will be taking place. So I think the answer to the question how has got to be informed by policy. It's got to be informed by government decision-making and the funds that follow that. And we do need to work hard to make sure that we encourage those sorts of policies that bring about those ends, such that education can be a lot more inclusive than what it is at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And look, we are at a very interesting time in history where there are lots of conversations happening about diversity and inclusion and how our institutions engage with those. And that is an international issue for all of us to deal with. So it'll be really interesting to see moving forward what the implications are for our institutions, particularly where funding and the approach and the way that a university is approaching accessibility is then impacting on any funding that they may or may not be eligible for. So yeah, it's an interesting space to watch. So I will now go back to the panelists and ask the question about good practice, bad practice, or things that have worked. And that will then be the last question. We're then going to have a poll, and then I'll open to questions. So if you do have a question, start thinking about that or put it in the chat for us to get to. But I'll go to you, Mark, because you're in front of me right now and on the big screen. So yeah, so what's worked well? Have you got an example of where you've seen really good practice, or that's worth modeling, or something that's prompted you to think about accessibility as a particular case?
Well, dealing with the different forms of accessibility we talked about earlier, in terms of being inclusive, enabling education for anyone to be able to participate, there are plenty of wonderful examples around the world in the shape of open universities. So many of these have hundreds of thousands, some have millions of students each year, teaching at scale at a distance, using some tried and true models, which those of you with a history in open distance learning will be fully familiar with. So I think at the macro scale, we know that it can be made to work. We can provide educational opportunities for people who aren't close to a campus, whether or not they have the technological infrastructure. There are benefits to having that infrastructure, but it's not necessarily a limitation on providing effective education. So in that sense, I think just look to any one of the massive open universities around the world who are doing this and are doing it exceptionally well. On the accessibility side, in terms of disability, I'm only really familiar with the work that we do at Open Polytechnic. And we have a very integrated online education design. And as a part of that, it's easy for us to provide accessibility technologies to bring to bear. So I think about 10 years ago, if someone was disabled, that one of the first things they would call for is a paper version of the course, the entire course accessible on paper. These days, it's much more accessible for us to provide it to them digitally and have it integrated with the sorts of tools that provide closed captions for every video, including third-party videos such as YouTube. We subscribe to a service that enables closed captions to be put alongside those clips, regardless of whether or not they're built in. We have applications like Helperbird. We use another one for students with ADHD. So there's a lot of really clever applications now to support disabled students as they learn using digital means. So yeah, I think there's a few good examples around the world. Again, open universities would be a good role model, I think, for those looking for large-scale inclusive education. And I'd be looking at electronic apps, digital apps, leveraging well-designed digital resources for the other disabled access side of things.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And Janet, you got any good practice or case studies you can share? Aside from growing a new university, of course.
I think because I come from a world of open and distance flexible learning, I think the space of that is something that I think they've always thought around accessibility and providing that. But to this stage, I would be wanting to learn from all of you. But I think I agree with Mark that in the world of flexible, open and distance learning, I think there's been, accessibility has been a part of the, mantra. How do we make life accessible or opportunities accessible for students? Who can't make it to campus and can study and learn anywhere and anytime.
Thanks, Janet. And Darren.
I've seen lots of pockets, and it's one of those. I don't think I've seen, anybody get it 100% right. And as I said, I think that's a fool's errand, and there's no such thing even defining what that looks like. Look, Mark hit the nail on the head with, this can be done at scale. It's been proven. There's some really good tools out there and systems that have had a lot of thought built into building it for scale, building for hundreds of thousands of users. It seems to be the smaller number of users, the more we struggle. With some of that concept as well. Look, it reminds me every year for the last few years, and started during COVID, AdSet's been running, accessibility in action awards, which is recognizing, those little pockets of accessibility, really good practice that's happening that often don't get that recognition. It's a small team, or it's an individual, or it's something that happened. And it reminds me of, I think it was couple of years ago, and it was the RMIT in Vietnam team, and we were going through the applications that came in for it and looking at, and they more or less started a disability service. How do we support students with disability, which aren't considered equal and aren't considered all these other things? We don't have government legislation that supports some of these things, but we're trying to do some good practice here. And again, because it's coming from Australia with RMIT. So them getting an award was game changing. Got in the local paper, then got in the national paper. Got in, because here's this small team that's doing something that some of us might well take for granted and say, well, we just do that in our institutions. And as we know, and as Jana's pointing out, that's not the case everywhere by any means. We're all at a different point. So yeah, some of those practices and just seeing some really good practice at small levels and helping celebrate those and highlight them and lift them up. I think that can also help government policy as well, where you see good practice and say, oh, how can we build on some of those things? Look, but I've seen lots and lots of them, so there's probably too many to look at or to name just one. But the ones that I find the most effective, where it's taking kind of, again, that UDL kind of approach, that's it's the +1 approach. What's the one thing we can do right now, and then what's that next thing that we can do? It's not about trying to change it all at once. So you see the teams that do one thing and then realize, oh, that's actually possible, and then see the rewards of that, see the student feedback, etc., and do that. And yeah, and Mark also touched on things like some of the apps and things that are out there, and we do not spend enough time showing some of those just to teaching staff to show, look, these are some of the apps that you can also engage with and you can demonstrate and help students with their learning. They can actually help you as well. You don't need to have a disability to use some of these apps, and that's that great meshing that's kind of happening with technology at the moment.
I think your point, and if you've touched on it, that success is contagious, isn't it? And it doesn't necessarily need to be at huge scale, So some good practice is embedded, and we just do it, like the big universities who've been doing distance education for however long. And then there is that, as you say, that really small scale. And I know that some projects, and there are some members on this call actually involved in those projects, where we got funding and we found that trying to do it too big was just, you got too much resistance, so let's just actually start really small, and then people be like, oh, actually what they're doing is working really well, and they want to be part of that, and then they actually sort of form the journey, and then it grows, that organic. There's something really special about that approach. Does anyone have any questions that they would like, or conversations or points that they would like to make, or things that we need to be thinking about as we progress over the year in thinking about accessibility? And I would like to also to acknowledge that we don't have a person with disability on this particular panel, but we are very conscious, and we did in fact invite a couple. So we are very conscious that in these conversations we need to have people with disability in the accessibility room, and we'll be continuing to engage. Justin, hi.
Hey Kate, how you going? I was going to type this, but what I wanted to say first is, I really agree that educator skills, which was mentioned before, is critical, for designing delivery and pedagogy, how to teach. So what I'm wondering, though, I don't quite understand benchmarks completely. Does a benchmark provide a way of prioritising or encouraging, certain amounts of professional development or types of professional development? Is that sort of how it works? Because, I'd love to see something like, some sort of practice mentoring, because you can go and sit in a PD, but to be able to actually work with someone, relatively closely and see how their sessions work, see how their resources work. It was mentioned before about design, sharing designs, and rather than reinventing the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so with the benchmark, does it provide that sort of, encouragement, priority? I don't know.
So the way ACODE, so I'll speak to the way that ACODE does our benchmarking. So the way that ACODE does our benchmarking is it becomes a self-assessment and then a conversation. So we would set up the accessibility benchmark. For us will be benchmark 10, and we would have a series of questions that we would then ask you to go through, and you would then go through. And it might be, for example, the question might be, does your institution have professional development to support educator upskilling in accessibility requirements for students, for example? And that's just off the top of my head. And then we might have a list of things that you ask yourself and you rank yourself, and it could be a 1. And so what you're talking about there, it might be mentoring and coaching, might be a line, or it might be professional development. It might be that we have institutional policy. It might be actually that it's in promotion, promotion application. Wouldn't that be amazing that higher education actually rewards really great accessible practice and, as something that's embedded? So that then speaks to the maturity model, because you might be on your beginning of your journey and you might go, you know what, actually, we haven't really thought about accessibility in our professional development. And certainly there would be many institutions that are not very mature in accessibility, other than a very narrowly defined, that funded model of disability accessibility, or whatever it might look like to the institutions. So that starts the conversation. And what we find is that some institutions are really hard on themselves, and other institutions, I think it's more common to be too hard on oneself. But then when we all get together for our benchmarking sessions, then we have conversations, and it might be that actually, Janet, your institution is doing really well, and you've self-assessed yourself as not. Or another institution, CQ University, might actually not be doing as well as maybe they think they are, and then everybody kind of self-adjusts. Now, because we haven't built these benchmarks, these conversations are really important. There's some stuff that's been brought up today that actually it's been on my mind, but I'm thinking actually that the dominance of that in the conversation here is actually means we need to push it up the agenda in terms of thinking about how we think about this, and that maturity model that we talked about. So you might run PD sessions, and they might be the stand and deliver online PD sessions that I know many universities have, or it might be sharing of the case studies. But that mentoring and sharing of practice or community of practice, that actually is a more advanced engagement, because you actually need to have someone who's quite expert to be able to mentor and coach someone else. And you may not actually have anybody who's on your staff. So how then do you prioritize the employment of staff who've got the skills to be able to then move that through your institution? So then that might mean that we then need to think about, in our benchmarking, our employment, and are we employing people who have skills to be able to drive an accessibility agenda through learning and teaching for technology at an institution? And I know CQ University quite well, because that was where I was before I went to Torrens. And we all know that in that institution we did a huge amount of work to upskill everybody, because we had quite a zero standing start in some instances from the knowledge, and it's come a huge amount of way because of a range of processes. And I'd be really interested to hear other people's perspectives on that. Does that help? Noting that I did say to the panel before I started that I'm unable to answer questions succinctly, so I apologize in advance.
I might just quickly jump in, Kate. Just follow that, because I was just typing and I thought it might just be easier to put some things in here. And look, you kind of touched on that a bit there as well. And we've all, brought it in different ways, I suppose. Accessibility is often a very abstract concept for many staff if they haven't been around it before. Is it the digital part? Is it this part? Are we just talking about ramps? Are we talking about, it's a whole range of different things. And so it's important that, I think when we're talking about, sharing, pairing, and collaborating on things, what accessibility actually looks like. And for some staff, their notion of what they think this is versus what it actually means, it might mean just putting headings in things. It might mean just, that's all this actually means. But the impact of that can be very broad and significant for, certain groups of students. It can also help with just collecting information. So, showing what accessibility looks like, I'm glad Justin raised that point, is really a point, is important. And I've often had, staff doing share and compares, and some staff in some faculties or schools have only ever seen their colleagues' website or LMSs and content management, and then they see something from a different discipline. Hang on, what's going on here? Why does yours look like that? What have you done here? Because the opportunity just really isn't there for them to even share amongst their peers, to recognize some of that practice and say, and again, last thing, sorry, it's also important to note there's a lot of good practice going on that's just not recognized as well. And for some staff to say, you're already doing some of these things, you're already doing some good practice. Am I? you're already dealing with accessibility with these things. Oh, I didn't know I was. So, it's a safe space to step into. So again, so for everybody to kind of recognize where am I at according to that standard as well, not just the institution.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. Ratna.
I'm really loving this conversation, and it's very timely for us at Edith Cowan University here in Western Australia. We've just set up our Accessible Learning Technologies reference group. So the idea is for all new learning technologies that we are considering for the university comes to this group first, made up of mainly students and some staff. And this technology is considered and then passed on to then the decision-making committees with recommendations. Now, we have a whole suite of tools as part of a major project at the university that we are onboarding, that we made a decision to onboard, but this group, it took a while to be birthed and just got established. So what we are trying to do is getting representatives from the group, and I'm in the group as well. And I co-founded this with our access and inclusion portfolio. So we're trying to get members of these groups to be represented in the user acceptance testing for these 10 new technologies that we are onboarding. So I've gone through my past user acceptance testing and user stories and trying to see what we can bring to the group to massage and kind of develop as a new user story, keeping in mind that it can be quite a bit of a workload burden because we have such a slew of technologies. I'll be quite keen to hear if anyone here, especially the panel and other members, have any advice or can point me somewhere with some sort of robust use cases that we can use for our testing, or just opening up the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Ratna. Those cases and the specificity of the requirements and the diversity that you need to cover here, which I think should be really clear by this panel, is really the biggest issue, and defining scope and working out exactly who you're talking about. And so I will let everybody communicate separately with Ratna because we are going to run out of time here today. But the good news for everybody is that we are running ACODE 93 workshop in a couple of weeks in New Zealand, hosted by University of Auckland. And what I would be hoping, Darren's going to be with us on that day, and Mark, hopefully you will find a way to drag you in as well. And Janet obviously is a member of ACODE, so it's open to our communities. And one of the things that I will be doing is walking through a vignette of where I see the challenges associated with the case studies, ranging from the student who has got a cochlear implant in class, where we've got the most beautifully technology room. It's got mics everywhere, but actually that student can't actually hear the lecturer at the front because someone is whispering at the back and it's interfering with their technology, to the student who's online, to the student who is a mature age student working at one of our regional university campuses, or Janet is in the Highlands of New Guinea somewhere. So we have just got such a different range of conversations that we need to have, and it's almost too big. And what we don't want our institutions to do is to walk away from these conversations because actually it's too big, and therefore then kind of make things too so you have to absolutely start somewhere with regard to testing. So happy to engage, and anyone. Actually, forum. Do you want to put that out on the forum, the ACODE forum as well, right now, with regard to our ACODE forum? Yeah, because I'm sure there'll be people who might be able to engage and possibly share through ICDE. So we've got Mark, whose design means of implementation straightforward and scalable across the institution. It's the execution that struggle with, absolutely. So look, conscious of time. So any final comments from our panel? Final statements.
Well, I think it's been a wonderful conversation. I've particularly enjoyed the breadth of it. I think we've covered a lot of ground over the last hour. It's been a real privilege learning from Janet and Darren.
Likewise.
I'll second that. No, it hasn't. Look, and it's great that these conversations are had. And as you said, it should be, it's a series of conversations. It's an ongoing discussion, as we've talked about, TESPIL in general. It's a journey, so the more we can talk about it, the more we can have unique and diverse perspectives in this, the better it is for all of us.
And Janet?
Yes, I think learning and conversation is a way, is something that I really appreciate from this conversation. And I think one takeaway from me from listening to the whole conversation this afternoon is the design aspect of it all. Like thinking through design's thinking. How do we do it? Yeah.
Look, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for turning up. Thanks to all of those people who'll be watching this online, because I do know if you're like me, that's how I do my my watching and engaging, because the day job is pretty full on. So look, thank you very much for taking part in the conversation today. So on behalf of ICDE and ACODE, really very, very thankful to you all for your interest. Hope to have lots more continuing conversations. We've got multiple forums across our institutions. We've got an MOU. We're working very closely together. It's a great relationship, and it's very international, which is really exciting for all of us. And hopefully we'll be able to leave a legacy with a new benchmark at the end of all of this at the end of the year, and we'll continue to work through. Happy to have any feedback along the way. So thanks.